July 1944. A grand old resort hotel in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, the kind of place built for rich vacationers to escape the summer heat, not for men to redraw the financial map of the planet. But that July, the Mount Washington Hotel was packed wall to wall with 730 delegates from 44 countries, and the elevators kept breaking down under the weight of bankers running between meetings. Outside, the Second World War was still raging. Paris hadn't even been liberated yet. And inside this hotel, while armies were still fighting and dying across Europe and the Pacific, a much quieter war was being fought over something most people back home would never think to call a battlefield: the question of whose currency would run the world once the shooting stopped. On one side of that fight sat John Maynard Keynes, the most famous economist alive, a man so intellectually towering that entire governments took his calls. He represented Britain, the nation that had run the global economy for over a century, the nation whose currency, the pound sterling, had once been as good as gold in every port from Shanghai to Buenos Aires. On the other side sat a far less famous man, an American Treasury official named Harry Dexter White, someone almost nobody outside Washington had heard of. And by the time those 3 weeks in New Hampshire were over, White's vision had won. Not because his ideas were necessarily better, because his country held the cards. That is the story people rarely get told properly. Not a story about a friendly conference where the Allies sat down and cooperatively built a fairer world. A story about how the United States, without firing a shot on this particular front, without annexing a single mile of territory, walked out of a mountain resort holding the deed to the global financial system. And it did it so smoothly, so wrapped in the language of cooperation and stability, that most of the world barely noticed what had actually changed hands. This is how it happened, and why the consequences of those 3 weeks are still shaping your bank account, your country's debt, and the price of everything you buy today. Hash the world before the handover. To understand what America actually won at Bretton Woods, you have to understand what the world looked like before it. For roughly a century before the First World War, the global economy ran on something called the classical gold standard. Currencies were pegged to gold, capital moved relatively freely across borders, and at the center of it all sat the British pound, backed by the Bank of England and the vast reach of the British Empire. London was the financial capital of the planet. When a merchant in Cairo or Calcutta or Buenos Aires wanted to settle an international trade, more often than not, sterling was the currency that made it happen. Then came 2 world wars, 20 years apart, and Britain's financial supremacy was bled out on the battlefield right alongside its soldiers. The country that once loaned money to half the planet had, by the end of the Second World War, borrowed itself into a hole it would spend decades climbing out of. Britain owed enormous debts, much of it to the United States through the Lend-Lease program, the arrangement under which America had supplied Britain with ships, planes, and equipment during the war. When Washington abruptly ended Lend-Lease in August 1945, Britain was left needing yet another American loan just to keep functioning, a loan it would not finish repaying until 2006. Let that sink in for a second. Britain was still paying off its World War II debt to the United States in the 21st century. Meanwhile, the United States had spent the war years in a very different position. American factories ran around the clock supplying the Allies. American farmland fed half the free world. And because so many countries were paying for American goods, weapons, and food with the one asset everyone still trusted, gold, the United States ended the war holding somewhere around 70% of the world's monetary gold reserves. Britain went from the world's greatest creditor to one of its greatest debtors in the span of about 30 years. America went from a rising industrial power to the undisputed financial center of the earth, and it did it largely by selling supplies to countries that were busy destroying each other. So when delegates gathered at Bretton Woods in the summer of 1944 to design the post-war economic order, The room was not actually a meeting of equals pretending to negotiate. It was a meeting between a nation that desperately needed a deal and a nation that could walk away from the table any time it wanted, because it was the only one holding the gold. Two plans, one winner. The intellectual battle at Bretton Woods came down to two competing visions, and understanding the difference between them tells you almost everything about what was really at stake. Keynes arrived with a genuinely radical idea. He wanted to create something called an international clearing union, essentially a kind of global central bank, that would issue its own international currency called the banker. Under Keynes's plan, no single national currency, not the pound, not the dollar, would sit at the center of world trade. Instead, this new synthetic currency would balance out trade surpluses and deficits automatically, and crucially, it would put pressure on surplus countries, the ones exporting more than they imported, not just deficit countries, to help correct global imbalances. Given that Britain was about to become a debtor nation, you can probably guess why Keynes wanted a system that wouldn't punish debtors quite so harshly. Harry Dexter White had a very different plan, and it is worth pausing on who White actually was, because his backstory is stranger than most people realize. He was a Harvard-trained economist who had become the right hand of Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, and decades later, declassified intelligence documents revealed that White had also been passing information to Soviet intelligence during this period, a claim that remains debated by historians, but that adds an unsettling layer to a man who was, at the same time, single-handedly designing the architecture of Western capitalism. Whatever his politics, White's economic vision for Bretton Woods was clear. He proposed an international stabilization fund, the institution that would eventually become the International Monetary Fund, built around fixed exchange rates where every currency would be pegged to the US dollar, and the dollar alone would be pegged to gold at $35 an ounce. No banker, no neutral synthetic currency sitting above the fray. Just the dollar, backed by the gold sitting in American vaults, as the anchor for the entire system. The negotiations between Keynes and White stretched across years, not just the 3 weeks at Bretton Woods itself. And by most accounts they were conducted with real personal respect between the two men. But respect wasn't the deciding factor. Leverage was. Keynes came to Washington and New Hampshire representing an empire that was, in blunt terms, running out of money and needed American goodwill just to keep the lights on. White came representing the only major economy left standing that had money to lend, gold to back it, and factories that hadn't been bombed. When historians describe the outcome, they don't usually describe it as a compromise. They describe it as an American plan with a few British fingerprints on it. The dollar became the world's currency, other nations pegged their currencies to it, and the dollar itself was the only currency still tied to gold. Everyone else was now, in effect, tied to America's promise. The man who lost. There is a human side to this story that rarely makes it into the textbooks, and it centers on Keynes himself. By the time he arrived in the United States for these negotiations, he was already a sick man, suffering from serious heart trouble that would kill him less than 2 years later, in April 1946. He nonetheless threw himself into round after round of exhausting negotiations, first over Lend-Lease, then over Bretton Woods itself, then over a separate and even more humbling post-war loan Britain was forced to request from Washington just to avoid bankruptcy. Keynes had entered these talks as the intellectual giant of the room, a man whose economic theories had already reshaped how governments thought about recessions and unemployment. He left them, by his own private admission to colleagues, having secured a far weaker deal for Britain than he had hoped, and having watched the banker, his signature proposal for a neutral global currency, quietly buried in favor of the American plan. What makes this detail worth including is not just the personal tragedy of it, though there is real tragedy in a dying man spending his final working years negotiating his own country's decline. It's what it reveals about how the takeover actually happened. Nobody forced Keynes out of the room. Nobody silenced him. He was heard, respected, occasionally even deferred to on technical details. And Britain still lost, decisively, because respect in a negotiating room does not substitute for leverage, and Britain had spent its leverage winning a war it could no longer afford to have won on its own terms. That is the quiet part of a quiet takeover. It doesn't need villains. It just needs one side to be out of options. The Marshall Plan and the dollar shortage. The years immediately following Bretton Woods exposed just how lopsided the new arrangement really was. Europe emerged from the war so devastated, and the United States so overwhelmingly, the only major economy still capable of producing food, machinery, and fuel at scale, that the world quickly ran into what economists at the time called the dollar shortage. Everyone needed dollars to buy American goods for Reconstruction, but almost nobody outside the United States was earning enough dollars through trade to pay for them. The brand new International Monetary Fund, still small and undercapitalized in its first years, could not come close to filling that gap on its own. Washington's answer was the Marshall Plan, announced in 1947, which funneled roughly $13 billion in aid, an enormous sum for the time, into rebuilding Western European economies between 1948 and 1951. It is often remembered fairly as an act of genuine generosity and enlightened self-interest, credited with helping prevent the kind of economic collapse and political radicalization that had paved the way for fascism after the First World War. But it is worth noticing what the Marshall Plan also did structurally. It further wired Western Europe's recovery directly into American dollars, American exports, and American strategic priorities during the opening years of the Cold War. The generosity was real. So was the fact that it deepened, rather than diluted, the dollar's grip on the global economy at exactly the moment European currencies were at their weakest and least able to offer any alternative. It would take until 1958 for the major European currencies to even become freely convertible again, meaning the Bretton Woods system as originally envisioned, with its full web of currencies pegged to the dollar and traders able to move freely between them, did not actually become fully operational until 14 years after the conference that supposedly created it. For nearly a decade and a half, the post-war system was really just the dollar, propping up a rebuilding world almost single-handedly, one Marshall Plan shipment and one IMF loan at a time. The architecture of quiet control. Here is where the takeover gets genuinely clever, because it wasn't just about which currency sat at the center. It was about who got to control the institutions built to manage that currency. Bretton Woods didn't just create an exchange rate system. It created two permanent international institutions: the International Monetary Fund, meant to help countries manage short-term balance of payments problems, and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which would later grow into the World Bank, meant to help fund reconstruction and development. Both institutions were structured around a system of quotas, where each member country's financial contribution determined its voting power. This sounds neutral and technical. It was not neutral. Because the United States held the deepest pockets by a wide margin, it secured the largest quota and with it, the largest single share of votes in both institutions. That might sound like a modest edge until you understand how the voting thresholds were designed. Many of the most consequential decisions at the IMF and the World Bank, things like changing the institution's own rules, adjusting quotas, or admitting new members, require an 85% supermajority to pass. The United States has, from the beginning, held a voting share comfortably above the 15% mark needed to single-handedly block any such decision. In other words, nothing structurally significant happens at either institution without American consent. Not most of the time. Never. It is a built-in veto, dressed up in the neutral language of quotas and percentages, and it has persisted with remarkably little change for 8 decades, even as the size of the American economy relative to the rest of the world has shrunk considerably since 1944. There was also an unwritten rule that emerged from this arrangement, one that still holds today. The head of the World Bank would always be an American, nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate, while the head of the IMF would always be a European. Two institutions meant to represent the entire community of nations. With leadership carved up in advance between the two winning powers of the negotiation, nobody voted on that gentleman's agreement. It just became how things worked, and it kept working because the countries who might have objected had no way to force the issue. So when you step back and look at the full picture, what America secured at Bretton Woods wasn't simply a strong currency. It secured the dollar as the reserve currency the whole system was built around, veto power over the two institutions managing that system, and a permanent seat at the head of the table, all locked into place using rules that looked on paper like fair and technical arrangements about quotas and gold reserves. That is what a quiet takeover looks like. Not tanks, paperwork. Hash the Golden Age and its hidden flaw. For roughly 2.5 decades, the system worked, and it worked well. The period from the late 1940s through the late 1960s is remembered in economic history as a genuine golden age. War-shattered economies in Western Europe and Japan rebuilt and boomed. Trade expanded. Currency crises, the kind that had ripped through the world economy in the 1920s and 1930s, became far rarer because everyone's currency was anchored to the dollar, and the dollar was anchored to gold. It gave the world something it had been starving for since 1914, predictability. But baked into the system from day one was a contradiction that a Belgian-American economist named Robert Triffin would eventually put a name to, a problem now known as the Triffin dilemma. Here's the issue in plain terms. For the rest of the world to conduct trade and hold reserves, they needed dollars, lots of them, flowing out of the United States and into foreign central banks. But the only way dollars could flow out into the world in that volume was for the United States to run trade deficits and send money abroad. And the more dollars piled up in foreign vaults, the more those foreign governments started asking an uncomfortable question. Could the United States actually back every single one of those dollars with real gold at $35 an ounce, the way it had promised? As the years went on, and the pile of dollars overseas kept growing, while America's gold stockpile stayed roughly fixed, the honest answer increasingly became no. The dollar, as a reserve currency, needed the world to trust it completely. But maintaining that trust required America to keep giving away the very gold that trust was supposedly backed by. It was a system that worked beautifully right up until people started actually testing the promise behind it. By the late 1960s, that testing had begun in earnest. Inflation was rising in the United States, partly from the cost of the Vietnam War and domestic spending programs, and foreign governments, France in particular, started openly converting their dollar reserves into gold rather than sitting on paper promises. A group of central banks had already tried to paper over the cracks earlier in the decade through something called the London Gold Pool, an arrangement where several countries agreed to sell gold together to keep its market price stable near $35 an ounce. That pool collapsed in 1968 under the weight of speculative pressure. By the summer of 1971, both France and Britain were signaling they intended to convert significant dollar holdings into American gold, and the U.S. gold stockpile was shrinking fast enough that the entire foundation of the system was visibly at risk. The weekend America rewrote the rules again. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon went on national television and announced what would later be called the Nixon shock. Among a series of economic measures, wage and price controls, a new import surcharge, the headline decision was this: the United States would suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Foreign governments that had spent nearly 3 decades holding dollars on the understanding that they represented a fixed claim on American gold were, essentially overnight, told that claim no longer applied. The gold window, as it was called, was closed. It has never reopened. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is one of the more remarkable acts of unilateral financial power in modern history. The entire Bretton Woods system had been built around a single American promise: $35 buys 1 ounce of gold, guaranteed. When honoring that promise became inconvenient for the United States simply stopped honoring it. There was no vote at the IMF. There was no summit of the 44 nations that had originally signed on in New Hampshire. There was a television broadcast. Within about a year and a half, the fixed exchange rate system that had defined Bretton Woods was effectively dead, replaced by the floating exchange rates most of the world's currencies still use today. And here is the part that should genuinely surprise you, because it is the opposite of what most people assume happened next. Conventional logic says that when America broke its core promise, the promise that had made the dollar trustworthy in the first place, the dollar should have collapsed. Confidence should have evaporated. Instead, in the years that followed, the dollar became even more entrenched as the currency the entire world runs on. That did not happen automatically. It happened because Washington moved quickly to build the dollar a new foundation, one that didn't depend on gold at all. Trading gold for oil. The foundation America built to replace gold came from an unlikely place: the deserts of Saudi Arabia. In October 1973, following the Yom Kippur War and the American resupply of Israel, the Arab members of OPEC imposed an oil embargo on the United States and other Western nations, and the price of crude oil roughly quadrupled within a few months. It was a genuine crisis for the American economy. But out of that crisis, U.S. officials, most notably Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, worked out a series of understandings with Saudi Arabia through the mid-1970s. There was never a single dramatic secret treaty, despite what internet legend often claims. It was closer to a set of overlapping economic and military arrangements, formalized through joint U.S.-Saudi commissions established in 1974, in which the United States offered military support and investment cooperation, and Saudi Arabia, already accustomed to pricing its oil in dollars as a holdover from the Bretton Woods era, continued doing so and began recycling much of its enormous new oil wealth back into American assets, particularly U.S. Treasury bonds. The effect of this arrangement, often referred to as the petrodollar system, was to hand the dollar a new anchor. Gold no longer backed the dollar. Global demand for oil did. As long as most of the world's oil kept getting priced and paid for in dollars, every country on Earth that needed to buy energy needed to hold dollars first. That single fact created a permanent, built-in global demand for the American currency that had nothing to do with gold sitting in a vault in Kentucky. And the oil money flowing back into U.S. Treasury bonds gave the United States something almost as valuable as the demand itself: a steady stream of foreign capital willing to fund American government borrowing at relatively low cost, year after year, decade after decade. So the sequence is worth spelling out plainly, because it is genuinely one of the more audacious pivots in modern economic history. America built the post-war system around a promise backed by gold. When that promise became too expensive to keep, America simply ended it. And rather than lose its position at the center of world finance, it quietly built a new anchor out of oil, arms deals, and treasury bonds, one that, if anything, proved more durable than gold ever was, because it didn't require America to hold a fixed, finite physical asset. It only required the rest of the world to keep needing dollars, and the rest of the world, it turned out, still did. What America actually walked away with. Add it all up, and here is the inheritance the United States carried out of that mountain hotel in 1944 and has been quietly renewing and updating ever since. The dollar became, and remains today the dominant reserve currency on Earth. As of recent data, the dollar still makes up well over half of all disclosed global foreign exchange reserves, far ahead of the euro and dramatically ahead of the Chinese yuan. That is not a natural law of economics. It is the direct institutional legacy of decisions made in a hotel conference room 8 decades ago, decisions that have been reinforced through the collapse of gold convertibility, the rise of the petrodollar, and the ongoing structure of institutions that America still effectively controls the veto power over. That dollar dominance comes with advantages that are easy to overlook precisely because they are so quiet. Because the world needs dollars, and because so much of that need gets recycled into U.S. government debt, the United States can borrow money more cheaply than almost any other country on the planet, running budget deficits that would trigger a currency crisis almost anywhere else. Because so much of global trade and banking runs through dollar-denominated transactions and the American financial system, Washington has an extraordinary tool most nations can only dream of: the ability to cut a foreign bank, company, or entire country off from the global financial system through sanctions, simply by denying it access to dollars. That is not a power that was written into any treaty at Bretton Woods. It is a power that flows naturally from a financial architecture that was designed, quietly and deliberately, with the dollar at its absolute center. It's also worth being precise about what this system did and didn't do for ordinary Americans, because the picture isn't a simple one. Dollar dominance has real, tangible benefits that show up far outside Wall Street. It has historically kept the cost of imported goods lower than it would otherwise be, made overseas travel and shopping cheaper for American consumers, and given the U.S. government room to borrow heavily during genuine emergencies, wars, financial crises, pandemics, without the kind of immediate market panic that would hit almost any other country running similar deficits. But the same arrangement has also been blamed, fairly or not, for hollowing out parts of American manufacturing over the decades, since a permanently strong, high-demand dollar makes it harder for American-made goods to compete on price overseas. The quiet takeover of the global economy was never purely a story of America extracting wealth from everyone else. It was, and still is, a story with real trade-offs even for the country that won the negotiation, trade-offs that show up today in arguments over tariffs, offshoring, and the trade deficit that are really, underneath the surface, still arguments about the deal struck in that hotel back in 1944. None of this required America to conquer anyone. It required winning a negotiation most of the world wasn't paying close attention to, structuring two of the most powerful economic institutions on Earth around a voting system that entrenched permanent American influence. And then, when the original terms of the deal became inconvenient decades later, simply rewriting them unilaterally and building a new foundation before anyone could meaningfully object. It is, in a very real sense, the most successful economic campaign in modern history, and most Americans have never been taught the details of how it actually worked. Why this still matters. It would be easy to file all of this under ancient history, something that happened to a bunch of men in suits at a hotel decades before most of us were born. But the architecture built at Bretton Woods and rebuilt in 1971 and rebuilt again through the petrodollar arrangement is not a museum piece. It is the system you are living inside right now. Every time you check a price tag, every time your government issues new debt, every time you read a headline about sanctions on a foreign country or a rival nation trying to reduce its dependence on the dollar. The system has cracks today too. Rising government debt, questions about long-term fiscal discipline, and the emergence of economic blocs like the BRICS nations actively discussing alternatives to dollar dominance are all, in their own way, the 21st century version of the pressure that built up on the London gold pool back in the 1960s. Nobody knows exactly how or when the next major shift in this system will happen. but history suggests it will not arrive with a dramatic announcement from a rival power. It will most likely arrive the same way American dominance did in the first place. Quietly, through institutions, negotiations, and decisions most people won't notice until decades later, when someone finally explains how it happened. You can already see the early tremors of the next chapter if you know where to look. When the United States and its allies froze a large portion of Russia's foreign currency reserves following the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, it was, among other things, a demonstration of exactly how much power sits behind a dollar-centered financial system, the power to freeze a country out of its own savings almost overnight. That demonstration did not go unnoticed. In the years since, countries like China, India, Brazil, and Russia have been holding regular summits under the BRICS banner exploring alternative payment systems and reduced dependence on the dollar for trade settlement. So far, none of these efforts have come close to seriously challenging the dollar's position. The Eurozone tried something similar decades ago, and the euro still sits a distant second in global reserves. But the direction of the pressure is unmistakable, and it echoes, in a strange way, the exact dynamic that built up against the gold standard in the late 1960s. A system built on trust in one dominant power eventually invites the rest of the world to start asking whether that trust still makes sense. That is really the through line of this whole story. Empires used to be built with armies and flags planted in foreign soil. The most consequential empire of the last 80 years was built with exchange rates, quota formulas, and a gold window that closed on a Sunday night broadcast. It was so effective precisely because it didn't look like conquest. It looked like cooperation, like stability, like the kind of dry technical arrangement nobody bothers reading the fine print on. And that, more than any tank or missile, is how you take over a global economy quietly. If this actually changed how you think about where the dollar in your wallet comes from and why it holds the power it does, do me a favor and hit subscribe, because this channel is going to keep digging into the financial history that shapes the world you're living in right now, the kind of story that never quite makes it into a school textbook. And I'm genuinely curious where this is landing with people, so drop a comment and let me know what state you're texting from. I want to see how far this reaches across the country. I'll see you in the next one.